So what I wanted to look at today is the fears, blocks and resistances to compassion. So to look a little bit more at how we resist compassion, why that shows up and how we might work with that. Because actually, most people, when they start to be self-compassionate, especially when you're struggling with your mental health, experience some resistance from our mind or our emotions inside. And so this is very common. Our brains don't like change. They like a familiar environment. They would rather know what's going to happen and what to expect and be able to predict the danger than try something new and risk a change that could be difficult. It could make things worse. So often that resistance, the function is to keep us in this familiar state that our mind can predict. We see this in animals studies. So animals will stay in a dangerous environment rather than go out into the world and find a new territory, a new environment. So they'll go back to where they're electrocuted rather than, go out and find a new territory. And our minds are a little bit like this as well. We often stay in the familiar patterns. And so as soon as we start to change things, we get some resistance. In mindful self-compassion, a type of compassion-focused therapy, they talk about backdraft. So when we start to engage in compassion practices, it's a little bit like when firemen go into a burning building, and if they open the door in one go, you get a huge roaring fire coming out. And this fire in this metaphor is shame. It's our shame and our inner critic and difficulty. So sometimes when we start to do self-compassion work, all of that comes up. And so the antidote to this, much like the fireman metaphor, is to poke the little holes in the burning building to let the oxygen in. So if we do little bits of compassion practice, little bits over time, our mind starts to adapt and adjust to it, and it becomes more natural and we'll get less resistance. So the number one principle is kind of small practices many times, like over and over again, doing these short practices. But there are lots of different blocks and barriers that might come up. So I thought I'd mention a few of them, and then if we explore what you feel might be your resistance or barrier or fear or block to compassion. So one of the number one barriers that I experience in this work with clients is that people are often very good at being kind to other people, but struggle to do it to themselves. So that compassion flows out very well, but the inner flow, is more difficult. This can be cultural. There's certainly something in our culture that can see it as an indulgence or weak or letting ourselves off the hook. It can be historical, and we'll look at some of the more specific historic factors here. But essentially, if we haven't been trained a lot to be kind and compassionate and supportive to ourselves from a young age, then that hasn't been internalized and it isn't in our mind and our default state. And this can come about by different ways. It can come about by harsh external criticism in our early attachments or our school experience or something else, but it also can come about by modeling. If those around us, if our attachment figures were very harsh and critical to themselves, then we learn that and we pick that up and we internalize that. And they've done studies on our sort of internal self-talk, and it really gets formed or at least set in motion when we're very young. So that the way we talk to what we see around us in the world, what we experience, all starts to form that internal self-talk and that internal self-concept. So, it might be that it's your early experiences and the life you've led, related to this. And the cultural one is it can be seen that it's weak or indulgent, or it could be letting us off the hook, which is quite bizarre because compassion couldn't be further from this. Compassion is not doing things that let ourselves off the hook. It's not giving up on important goals or allowing ourselves to do behaviors that temporarily relieve the pain but long-term create pain for us and difficulty, because that's not kind. All of that adds up to a lot more suffering and pain, and compassion is all about alleviating suffering with this wisdom function, this long-term view. So it couldn't be further from that, and it isn't letting you off the hook. It is a different motivational system, and if we've had a motivational system to be very hard on ourselves, to keep cracking the internal whip and keep us plowing on to achieve stuff, then we can be frightened to let go of that motivational system, that harsh, critical one, and try a more supportive, compassionate motivation system. So again, we have to develop it slowly. We have to use diffusion and acceptance of the resistance that comes up. And there's probably more we could say there. But the next barrier really is around worthiness. People can feel they're not worthy of it because of things they regret, past mistakes. People are often incredibly hard on themselves around this, like mistakes that they would forgive in other people, they don't forgive in themselves, or see that there's a bigger context. There's a reason that mistake was made. There was a history feeding in. There was a lot of external factors. And even if there's some healthy guilt, the unhealthy guilt and the shame mean that we take too much responsibility, and we don't see that we probably didn't have many choices, especially if we were younger and in childhood, where we have very little agency or control. So sometimes there's this sense of our past and our worthiness and regret that blocks it. There can be that it doesn't feel safe, and this can relate to our attachment history. If we have had traumas or difficulty where kindness was paired with someone taking advantage of us or some sort of difficulty, then as soon as we experience kindness and compassion, that fear system comes up, the threat system comes up to protect us, because it thinks, okay, I've been vulnerable before when there's been kindness here. I don't want to go near this again in case there's some danger or someone's going to betray or take advantage of me. Or, that could be internal as well. We might have been kind to ourselves at some point and it's been paired with something going wrong or something difficult. It can be very much the trigger of painful emotions. So if we're kind to ourselves, it can trigger grief. We grieve that we didn't experience that in our childhood. We didn't have kind, supportive attachment figures or school experiences or other things like that, or sibling or peer experiences. And there's a lot of grief, a lot of pain. As we start to be kind, we realize what we didn't get and what we missed out on. So we need to extend compassion to that reaction and mindfulness to that reaction, which is a principle throughout, really. Whatever comes up in response to the barriers, we extend compassion to as well. And there could be other emotions that triggered, anxiety or low mood or other things come up as we start to do compassion. And so we think, oh, this doesn't feel good, it's not working. But actually we just need to keep going, have that strength and that wisdom and give it a little bit longer, and then our system will adjust and recalibrate and start to accept it. There can be a fear of positive emotions. If throughout our life we couldn't trust a positive environment, there would be good experiences as a kid, and then there would be some really traumatic, difficult stuff, then we couldn't trust positive emotions, so we're always wary. Sometimes people feel like if I enjoy stuff, something's going to go wrong in my life. There can be a bit of magical thinking that there's some link between those two, when really, that's more us as a kid feeling playful and joyful, and then something going wrong, or someone shouting at us or being harsh or something like that. So we pair those positive emotions with those bad experiences, and there's fear there. Or people might have shamed us or taught us that positive emotion wasn't right, or calm down, don't get too excited, something's going to go wrong, or you're going to do something wrong. So there can be this link with there hasn't been a safe experience with positive emotions, and that can play out as well. And then finally, and this is an exhausted list, there's other barriers as well, but if we're very numb from depression, if we're not feeling a lot right now, or dissociation and anhedonia, which is lack of positive emotion, and sort of numbness have come up to protect and dissociate from pain, then we just don't feel much. We do the practice and we don't feel very compassionate or kind, and we think it's not working or it's not right for us. But really it's a motivation. Compassion is a motivation, it's not a feeling. So we keep this intention, this motivation, and in time, typically we do activate these positive feelings as well. And a lot of the research shows you see improvement in all the positive emotions when you train compassion, you know, gratitude, pleasure, satisfaction, peace, calm, excitement, all of them will increase with compassion training. But that's a side effect. Actually, it's a motivation. You know, the fireman running into the burning building is not feeling loving and warm and kind. They're feeling adrenalized or focused or action orientated or frightened even. So yeah, there's some ideas about the blocks and barriers.